Welcome to The Sound of Economics, the podcast series by Bruegel, the Brussels-based economic think tank. I'm Giuseppe Porcaro, and today we are going to discuss about the democratic disenchantment in rich and poor countries. For this conversation, I'm happy to welcome Pranab Bardhan, who is Distinguished Professor Emeritus of Economics at the University of California, Berkeley, and Heather Grabbe, who is a Senior Advisor to the Open Society Foundations and Europe's Futures Fellow at the Institute of Human Sciences in Vienna. Pranab, Heather, thanks a lot for joining The Sound of Economics.
Thank you, Giuseppe.
Glad to be here.
The retreat of liberal democracy in the 21st century has been impossible to ignore so far. In 2021, the VDEM Institute at the University of Gothenburg in Sweden produced the largest global dataset on democracy, ringing an alarming bell as autocracies now rule the majority of people in 87 countries that are home to 68% of the global population, with liberal democracies having a population share of only 14%. Anti-democratic movements have taken root globally in a wide range of demographic and socioeconomic groups. In the United States, older, less educated rural populations have withdrawn from democracy. But in India, the prevailing Hindu nationalists enjoy the support of educated, aspirational urban youth. And in Europe, anti-democratic populists firmly back the welfare state, but for non-immigrants. There are many questions which might be difficult to answer, but we will try at least to address three of them in this podcast. First of all, what are the commonalities, if any, in this global retreat of democracy? Second, as we are at The Sound of Economics, I would like to know more about which are the correlations with the economics at systemic level, at territorial level, and at personal level. Third, which are the ideas that could be put forward at policy level in order to face this situation. But to start with, Pranab, you extensively wrote in your latest book, A World of Insecurity, about the retreat of democracy. Can you sketch for our listeners the global situation to understand better what we are discussing?
Yes, thank you, Giuseppe. This retreat of democracy has been going on for some time, but it's been accelerated in the last decade. And my book is both about rich and poor countries. So this retreat has taken place in the industrially advanced countries as well as the developing countries. Industrially advanced countries, of course, we have seen Trump, Brexit in Britain, and then in France, Marine Le Pen, which is an extreme right party, did quite well, lost the presidential election. But remember, she got, I think, about 42% of the vote in France. And then even in Germany, even though Social Democrats are now in power, there is this very strong opposition from the right-wing extreme party, which is, I think it's called the AfD party. In Poland, PIS is the ruling party. In Hungary, Viktor Orban is almost an autocrat. Then most recently, we had in Italy, the prime minister now is from a party which has some neo-Nazi, neo-fascist roots in some sense. And then in Sweden, a party with the Sweden Democrats, a party with neo-Nazi roots is very strong now. It's the second largest party backing the current government. And in other countries outside Europe, Israel recently elected extreme right-wing party. Turkey, Erdogan has been, which is a right-wing party, has been there for quite some time. And in India, of course, Narendra Modi has been ruling for the last 8 years, which is an extreme right party. And these rulers have been, and of course, I left out another very important developing country, which is Brazil, which has been ruled by Bolsonaro until very recently. And now in the last election, Bolsonaro lost, but just remember, he got 49.1% of the vote. So the anti-democratic forces have been very strong all over the world. And that's what I'm much of the book on democratic disenchantment is about, trying to understand it, trying to think of its consequences, and also what to do now.
Thank you, Pranab. And indeed, this is, as I was saying before, a very worrying trend. And Heather, would you like to add something to this first panoramic view, which definitely is it's gloomy, as we know?
What I find really interesting about Pranab's book, A World of Insecurity, is the way that he looks not only at democratic disenchantment in countries that have been very extensively studied, the United States, European countries, but also at developing countries, particularly the ones that he has written about a lot in the past, India, China. And he really looks at the common economic factors which drive that disenchantment. And that's an unusual take on it, which is really interesting. I think what you see across the spectrum is how much all societies, at whatever level of income, people display a strong sense of loss aversion. They're really afraid of losing what they have, even whether it's a lot or actually very little in material terms. And especially how afraid they are of losing community, how they are afraid they are of losing traditions that they hold dear, familiar ways of life, things that they feel threatened from outside. And what's in common between all of the leaders who've come to power from radical right populism, which he just listed, is the promise to take people back to a previous age in which they somehow believed that things were safer. There was more security of identity and community, as well as more economic security. So if you think about the famous Trump slogan, "Make America Great Again," what really makes that a populist slogan is the again part. Every politician promises to make their country great, but it's the nostalgia about doing it again that is really the factor that you see in common. And a promise which is of simple answers to complex questions, particularly economic questions. What these strongman leaders often promise is that somehow they will protect people from the anonymous forces of global markets, of globalization. Usually they can't actually do that, but they give the illusion that they can. And so this promise of identity security, of restoring community, and also of providing some kind of protection from economic insecurity is a very powerful political playbook, which has now been used around the world by all kinds of leaders in many different circumstances. And it's very important to look at what has made people feel so insecure. It's the precarity, the creation of a sort of precariat of workers, especially in labour markets, both in wealthy and poor countries, which Pranab points out, is really important. This idea of left behind, people who feel that their job is always under threat. And of course, a job is more than simply economic security. It often provides identity, it often provides dignity, and it often provides a sense of community. Even in quite desperate economic circumstances, people feel that when they're all working in the same coal mine or in the same factory, they have some kind of solidarity. So all of these factors put together, you can see why there is this huge appeal of populism, even if it actually doesn't deliver the economic security that people are craving.
Thank you, Heather. In fact, one additional question, I also had some remarks from what we heard from Pranab. One of the phenomena that we've been seeing in the past, beside the very interesting analysis that Heather was just saying at the moment, was the fact that a lot of these movements are using the current democratic structures, the current electoral democracy. Indeed, we have this new phenomena which is becoming mainstream, which is the concept of electoral autocracy, which to me it seems particularly interesting to elaborate a little bit more into, because a lot of these phenomena, a lot of these rises of parties which are challenging the democratic arena, they keep using the electoral systems, but they're definitely transforming it or using it in a different way. You mentioned Hungary, Turkey, and of course you mentioned India. So this could be key to understand what is going on, also at the procedural level about, because if you look at the state of democracy, you can look it with different prism. You can look at the actual political results, but you can also look it from the procedural point of view. And some analysts could completely refute this argument that democracy is at danger, even in those countries that are quite, visibly taking a path which is diverging from what we would say a healthy democracy.
Yes, let me comment on that. This is a qualitative difference from the retreats of democracy in earlier decades. Earlier, you often have a decline of democracy when there's a military coup or something. Now, military coups still exist. For example, most recently in Sudan, in Burkina Faso, in Myanmar, there have been military coups. But more and more now, in most countries, democracy dies, if I may use an expression, not with a bang, but with whimper. It slowly gets eroded. The democratic institutions and the civic norms that are associated with democracy, they gradually die. It's more like the proverbial frog in the pan. It gets slowly boiled to death. So that's what is happening to democracy. There is no sudden coup. Now, the way it's happening is through the electoral process, and that's related to the electoral autocracy. Large numbers of people in these countries that I mentioned are in the spell of strong leaders who come with their ideas about, as Heather mentioned, about making the country great again, and also seductive promises of what they're going to do. And people are in their spell and vote in large numbers. So what has happened is now what is called majoritarianism. So the majority is with the leader, but this majority is not a democratic majority. Now, this is where the electoral autocracy idea comes. Although I should mention that there is some division among political scientists on the definition of democracy. Some political scientists have a highly minimalist definition of democracy. They say we'll call a country democracy if it has contested elections. And in that sense, India has contested elections. Even Hungary has contested elections. Although even though it started, but in Putin's Russia, I think it's no longer contested elections. So as long as there is contested elections, some political scientists regard that as a democracy. I don't subscribe to that minimalist definition of democracy, because once elected by these majoritarian forces, they then trample upon the standard human rights that democracy is associated with, the standard freedoms of expression, freedoms of association, and things like that. If those are trampled, then I don't call a country democracy. In fact, media, the opposition is hounded in many of the countries that I mentioned, is regularly media and other opposition. The minorities, I think, is a very important part of democracy, is respect for rights of minority and respect for the right of dissenters. And that's what is being violated in many of these countries. And in that sense, the essence of democracy is gradually disappearing. So in that sense, these countries have become electoral autocracy. Elections take place, even competitive elections. But even there, let me qualify it. Sometimes they are competitive elections in the sense there are competing candidates, but they're not on the level playing field. For example, in India, 90% of the corporate donations to political parties goes to one party. That's the ruling party. So it's not a level playing field. Similarly, by suppressing the media, suppressing journalists, you don't allow the competition to be again on a level playing field. So in that sense, yes, there is competitive elections in some of these countries, but limited competition. And then, as I'm saying, that competitive elections is not the only thing. The essence of democracy lies in respect for minority rights and respect for the rights of dissent.
Thank you. And I see Heather might disagree with that definition, or was just a sign of your head.
I'm all for minority rights and respect to pluralism in societies, but I think there's a very important institutional dimension to all of this. As a political scientist, I would draw a very clear distinction between procedural democracy, having elections, going through the motions of democracy, and substantive democracy. And for substantive democracy, in addition to respect for minorities and allowing dissent, as Pranab rightly pointed out, you have to have free and fair elections, which are underpinned by media pluralism and particularly by separation of powers. And the big problem that we've had with these strongman authoritarian democracies, illiberal democracies, as some of them call themselves, that have emerged a lot in recent years is one-party takeover of state institutions. So a party is not content with having a majority, even a supermajority in the parliament. They also want to control the judiciary. They also want to control, for example, the state broadcasting council. They want to control even the electoral authorities. So what we've seen is parties getting into power and then progressively reducing the separation of powers and seeking to put their people into all of the state institutions. And that prevents free and fair elections in the future because then people can't hear dissenting opinions. They get a lot of disinformation, basically through state propaganda. The government can control, for example, advertising that keeps newspapers funded. So all of these factors are absolutely critical. And if you look at the playbook adopted by leaders, you see this very clearly in Poland, but also in Hungary. The independence of the judiciary was one of the first things that the ruling party did when it got into power. Look at the United States, where, of course, Donald Trump also tried to, and even after leaving office, has tried to attack judicial officials, state prosecutors and the like. And, of course, famously, he encouraged the storming of the Capitol, which is, of course, the seat of Parliament in the United States. So this institutional factor is absolutely key. If you don't have independent institutions, you can't have substantive democracy.
Absolutely, it's a sort of snowball effect, if we can say.
And that's at every level of income. That can happen in rich countries and poor countries alike.
But here I would like to get back to the economics, because we've been starting by this second question that we wanted to trying to tackle, which is what kind of correlations with the economics we find in this analysis of the retreat of democracy. And Pranab, you have extensively written about that, so I would like to ask first to you, and then get some comments from Heather again.
Yes, certainly the economic issues are very important in this, but I think one needs a little more care in understanding which forces are dominant. Now, in some circles, people say because economic inequalities are rising, that must have something to do with the decline of democracy in many parts of the world. Some people say the neoliberal forces which are destroying the planet in terms of environmental damage, that has disaffected large numbers of people. I personally think while these factors are important, there are some other issues, and that's why my book is titled World of Insecurity. I think insecurity sometimes is more important than inequality in the minds of the working classes who are voting in large numbers for these strong, quote-unquote, strong leaders. So, for example, the working classes in many countries are rallying under the banner of leaders who are plutocrats. And Trump is a billionaire. Even Marine Le Pen in France is I'm told, is a multimillionaire. In Brexit, the original Brexit leader, Nigel Farage, in Britain, was a multimillionaire. So is Erdogan. So is Orban. And Mr. Modi in India, even though he's not a multimillionaire, he's very cozy with some of the Indian businessmen who are now among the richest billionaires in the whole world. So these people, the working classes, are rallying, and this is something that we have to understand, that rallying with the plutocrats. The leadership is being provided by the plutocrats. So it's not the inequality or what's the top 1%. I think it's the insecurity. Heather already mentioned about the loss of status. The insecurities, the status insecurity is sometimes much more important than how much money is going to the top 1% in the minds of the working classes. There's no doubt inequality is increasing. In fact, some of these leaders, going back to the environmental issue, some of these leaders have been destroying the environment. Bolsonaro in Brazil, most remarkably, was destroying the Amazon rainforest. So the environmental issue going the other way. And similarly, some of these leaders like Trump, other leaders in Europe, they try to, when they were in power, they tried to lower the taxes of the rich. So they are certainly not improving inequality. They're not merely damaging environment, they're lowering the taxes of the rich, and they are deregulating, including deregulating environment on the environmental question. So all this shows that the inequality, environment, etc., is less important. To me, insecurity is of two kinds. The insecurity that exercises in the minds of the voters of these leaders. Insecurity is economic insecurity, and of course, the economic insecurity is insecurity of jobs, insecurity of incomes, and things like that. But there is also cultural insecurity, and I can come back to that later. But by cultural insecurity, I mean the threat that my traditional culture is under threat. And that is maybe, this threat may be posed by, supposedly by immigrants, the threat maybe by minorities, and so on. So I can talk about cultural insecurity later, but since you've asked me about economics, let me mention something else about economics, not just threat of jobs and incomes. I think one reason of democratic retreat is related to the fact that in most countries, trade unions are in some decline. Why is trade union decline important for this? Because trade unions used to provide an anchor to many workers about in democratic institutions. Trade union itself was an anchor of collective solidarity. Trade unions gave a source of pride to workers. And since for many structural reasons, trade unions are in decline all over the world, this And trade unions also played a role in taming the xenophobic passions of the workers, taming and transcending those passions of the workers. So the decline of trade unions is an economic and cultural factor, which to me has weakened the resistance to the decline of democracy. So those kind of economic factors, economic insecurity in jobs and incomes, decline of economic institutions like trade unions, I think are very important.
Thank you. And these are very, very important elements that you mention. However, if I might say, you said at the beginning that you think it was not a systemic issue, but some of the insecurities that you're pointing out comes from a systemic problem. If you're speaking about insecurities when it comes to job precarization, if you think about insecurities coming from levels of income and even the decline of the trade unions, we know very well it has been systematically being, I wouldn't say orchestrated, but in any case by different forms, contractual forms and different forces within the system from the late 70s on, exactly because of a specific way of seeing the economic development and the worldwide economic system. So to a certain extent, you kind of come back, you kind of criticize the people that says this is not the fault of the neoliberal system, but to a very much what we are saying is basically pointing out some at least precarities or deficiency of the system itself.
Yes, I think I don't want to be misunderstood. I do think the factors that I'm emphasizing are systemic. I'm just saying that I find in the recent literature a lot more emphasis on inequality, neoliberalism, etc. Those are important. I don't want to deny that. But there are other issues which are primarily related to economic and cultural insecurity. That's the part that in my book I emphasize.
Thank you. Heather.
Well, I think an absolutely vital change that is coming, which will make all of this more complex, is, of course, climate change. And Pranab does talk about this in his book, that the sense of insecurity, particularly economic insecurity, is going to get much greater. And that's the case both in poor and in rich countries. For sure, those who are poorer will have fewer resources to protect themselves from the ravages of climate change and also the changes in the economic systems which will need to come in order to decarbonize our economies and avoid even more catastrophic climate change. But also in rich countries, this issue of loss aversion comes back again, because properties of wealthy people on the coast cannot be protected against hurricanes anymore, as we've seen recently in Florida. We see the way that infrastructure, which serves everybody in the community, things like water and power, are massively affected by extreme temperatures as well as extreme weather. So this, both the actual physical effects of climate change, the floods, the extreme heat, weather, and so on, and also the system change that needs to happen to decarbonize economies and make them sustainable, that brings fear to people at all levels of income. And this loss aversion is, I think, the biggest obstacle to maintaining democratic consent for a decades-long transition to a sustainable economy. And that, I think, is really important because we want the climate action to succeed in protecting people from the worst effects, and we also want democracy to survive. So I think that some of Pranab's policy recommendations need to be seen in the light of climate change and climate action, and to think about how people who've already suffered from precarity because of globalization and because of various economic crises will be reacting to the change that needs to come and to the changes that climate change will bring.
And on this, because we are going towards the end or the final part of our podcast, you mentioned, Heather, the policy recommendations, and indeed this was the third question that we would like to address in our conversation today. And given this analysis, given these insights that we've been speaking so far, I would like to ask Pranab, what will be your policy recommendations across the spectrum and the geography of the planet to face this problem?
Yes, since my book emphasizes insecurity, so obviously the policies would be about how to improve insecurity issues, both economic and cultural. The economic, obviously, and this is where I have 2 long chapters in my book on some ways of rejuvenating social democracy. Social democracy in recent years has been going through a bad patch, although it's now getting some revival. But social democracy, we have to rethink. But the important thing about social democracy is about solidarity and social insurance. And insurance against what? Insurance against insecurity. And this is what those things have to be strengthened. And of course, for strengthening the economic part of the social insurance, we have to restructure the public finance system. And so in my book, I talk about how to go about restructuring the public finance system in terms of more taxation of the rich. And by the way, I also, when I talk about public finance, I also talk about something that people don't usually discuss, about financing of elections. Quite often, social democrats became discredited because they were raising money from big corporate houses, which then, of course, wanted their pound of flesh. So strengthening systems of public finance of elections, to me, is very important. Then I also talk quite a bit about anti-monopoly measures and legislations. Corporate concentration has been increasing in many countries, both rich and poor, and that's why the anti-monopoly legislation should be a very important part. Then I also talk about increasing the voice of workers in the governance of companies, corporate governance. Germany is a major good example in terms of works councils, but in most rich and certainly in hardly any poor country, you will see workers' voice in corporate governance. And workers' voice is important not merely in getting a better share of the pie to the workers, but also in some other respects. Workers, for example, it's often found that when workers have better voice, they give more importance to how the multinational company does its outsourcing, relocating elsewhere, and also the issue of research. And to me, I spend quite a bit of time in my book on the direction of research. The way we are going now in terms of automation, artificial intelligence, etc., research is moving in a labor displacing direction, labor replacing direction. And if workers have some voice in the company, in the board of directors of the company, then research should be gradually redirected in a more responsible direction, labor empowering kind of activities which are labor empowering rather than labor replacing, and of course directions which are environment friendly. And I think redirecting innovations by private companies, and of course in the public research, in all this, a voice of the workers become very important. And then I discuss other policy issues in terms of international coordination. We need a great deal of coordination, and this was underlined in the recent health crisis that we went through, or still going through, the pandemic. And we've seen some good things in this and bad things. Good thing was that there was some international coordination in the basic research that went into vaccine development, quite a fast development of the vaccine. But we also saw a bad part of vaccine nationalism, namely many countries were hoarding vaccines, whereas many poor countries are still without the vaccine against COVID. But so a lot of international coordination in health. And of course, right now, this week, we have been discussing the international coordination issues in environment. And there are a lot of international coordination issues in trade, in tax harmonization across countries, because multinationals declared their profits elsewhere. I think I quote this in my book, that American multinationals declared their the profits they declare in Bermuda is much larger than the profits they declare in the whole of China. So that tells you that international coordination is needed in terms of tax and profit shifting. And also, of course, international coordination in other respects, like in organized crime, like in cybersecurity issues. There are large numbers, and unfortunately, nationalism, ethnic, narrow, poisonous nationalism that is being propagated by these strong leaders are not helpful at all in getting these necessary items of international coordination.
Thank you, Pranab. And I would like to ask Heather, because we are running out of time, to just comment. I know that this is a wide array of policy areas which Pranab has been touching upon, and but to sum up this red thread about addressing insecurity through policies, which is something that the right wings, extreme right wings parties seems to be doing quite successfully, it doesn't seem to be a chord that is striken across the mainstream, let's say, the other parties. So I think that the real takeaway from your analysis, Pranab, is really around this concept and how we can use it and how democratic parties can use it further. Heather, what are your last remarks around that?
Well, I think one of the most interesting chapters in Pranab's book is the one about universal basic income. Because as an economist, he goes through some of the fiscal arithmetic of introducing it, for example, for India. And he quotes Philippe van Parijs, who's a political philosopher here in Brussels, saying that although UBI was dreamed up for wealthy countries, it might actually be most usefully introduced first in poorer countries, particularly because it's a way of benefiting women who are otherwise very marginalized in the labor market. They're particularly insecure and in particularly precarious jobs, and who also bear the burden of caretaking in the family and in the community. So this very detailed analysis he does of how UBI might work and the benefits it could bring to reducing this insecurity, not necessarily inequality. And that's, I think, the key distinction in his book that's very different from others on this subject. That in terms of reducing insecurity, it gives people more of a buffer if they should lose their jobs, which allows for more democratic consent for changing the economy, but also because it helps to reduce the gender gap, which is behind so many of the social ills and other problems, wastage of resources in the economy. So I think the UBI chapter is really excellent, and particularly because he defends his notion of minimum economic security being a human right, which is really interesting in the context of the Sustainable Development Goals and other ways of looking at how insecurity might be addressed globally.
Absolutely. And unfortunately, this is all the time we have for this episode, even though we could go for hours discussing all the issues that are touched upon. I have the feeling that we just scratched the surface of the analysis of the situation and, of course, of the possible policy solutions for all this. So I would like to thank a lot Pranab and Heather for joining us today.
Thank you, Giuseppe.
And I would like to remind all our listeners that they can read in open access all the analysis by our scholars on our website www.bruegel.org. Until next time, bye-bye.